London. Marylebone. 34, Montagu Square. December 1966. Jimi Hendrix walked down the steps to the basement flat and unlocked the door. His new home. A ground floor and basement apartment in one of London's most prestigious neighborhoods. Central location. Beautiful Georgian architecture. And the rent? £30 a month. In central London. In 1966. £30. It was a steal. An impossible bargain. And it came with a connection to the biggest band in the world. Because this apartment belonged to Ringo Starr. The Beatles drummer was subletting the space. He bought a country house in Surrey but kept the lease on this Montagu Square property. And now Jimi Hendrix, the American guitarist who'd arrived in London just 3 months earlier, was moving in. Jimi shared the flat with his girlfriend Kathy Etchingham, his manager Chas Chandler, and Chandler's girlfriend Lotta Null. For people. Basement apartment. £30 a month total. It should have been perfect. And for 3 months, it was. Jimi wrote some of his most famous songs in that apartment. Released singles that would define his career. Played shows that made him a star. But then, one night in early 1967, while under the influence of LSD, Jimi decided the walls needed redecorating. He grabbed a can of whitewash and started painting. Everywhere. Splashing. Throwing. Creating psychedelic patterns that made sense only to his altered consciousness. By morning, Ringo's carefully decorated apartment looked like a Jackson Pollock painting had exploded across the walls. Ringo had no choice. He evicted Jimi. This is the story of the most famous apartment in rock and roll, and how one bad acid trip ended Jimi Hendrix's residency in a Beatles home. To understand the significance of 34, Montagu Square, you have to understand its history and why it became one of the most important addresses in rock and roll. The square itself was built between 1810 and 1815 as part of the Portman estate. Classic Regency terrace architecture, those elegant Georgian facades that define certain London neighborhoods. A communal garden in the center, surrounded by padlocked iron railings, accessible only to residents. Named after Elizabeth Montagu, an 18th-century social reformer, patron of the arts, Salonist, literary critic, and writer. A woman who understood the power of creativity and conversation. Fitting, then, that her namesake square would become a gathering place for some of the most creative minds of the 20th century. By the mid-1960s, Montagu Square had attracted London's artistic elite. Not far from Abbey Road Studios. Close to the West End. Central but quiet. The kind of place where you could live anonymously, or as anonymously as a rock star could live in Beatlemania London. The building at number 34 had housed various notable residents over the decades. Richard Hanbury Gurney, a British Member of Parliament. Lady Emily Charlotte Brown, daughter of the Marquis of Sligo, who died there in 1916 at age 86. The walls had witnessed over a century of London life. But nothing in that history compared to what would happen between 1965 and 1969. Ringo Starr leased Flat L in 1965, shortly before his marriage to Maureen Cox. The flat consisted of the ground floor and lower ground floor, what Americans would call the basement. 2 ways to enter, through the front door at ground level, or by walking down steps to the basement entrance where the main living space was. For a young married couple, even enormously famous ones, it was perfect. Close to Abbey Road Studios, just 1.3 miles away. Ringo could walk to Beatles recording sessions. Convenient. Practical. But Beatles fans discovered the address quickly. They always did. The Swiss embassy, located at the back of the building on Montagu Place, started complaining. Their back wall, visible from the street, became a message board for fan graffiti. An embassy spokesperson complained publicly in August 1965. Our back wall is now very unsightly, and we shall have to redecorate. Our chauffeur, who is French and took part in the First World War, says the language some of these young people use is worse than anything he ever heard in the trenches. If World War I trenches couldn't compete with Beatles fan language, you knew the situation was serious. Still, Ringo and Maureen lived there happily for a while. Until July 1965, when Ringo bought Sunny Heights, a country house in St. George's Hill, Weybridge, Surrey. £30,000 for a proper estate. Room to breathe. Privacy impossible in central London. They moved to Surrey. But Ringo kept the Montagu Square lease. The property was too valuable, too convenient, too connected to everything happening in London music. So he started subletting, turning the apartment into a creative space for the people in his orbit. First tenants. The Fool, a Dutch design collective employed by Apple Corps. They painted murals for the Apple Boutique on Baker Street, designed psychedelic clothes for all four Beatles, plus the Hollies, Marianne Faithfull, Procol Harum, Donovan, and Cream. They painted John Lennon's Rolls-Royce Phantom V in swirling psychedelic colors. The Fool left in March 1966. Then Paul McCartney moved in. Paul McCartney rented 34 Montagu Square in March 1966. At the time, he was living with his girlfriend Jane Asher's family at 57 Wimpole Street, not far away. But he wanted a creative space, a place to experiment without bothering the Ashers. Paul installed sound recording equipment throughout the flat, converted it into a makeshift studio. He worked with Ian Somerville, an electronics technician, computer programmer, and boyfriend of American novelist William S. Burroughs. Together, they pushed the boundaries of what recording technology could do. They experimented with tape loops, creating avant-garde sounds that would influence Beatles tracks. They recorded spoken-word performances. Paul invited poets and writers to the apartment, capturing their voices for what would become Apple's experimental Zapple label. William S. Burroughs himself recorded there. His distinctive voice, reading his experimental prose, preserved on tape in that basement flat. But Paul's most significant work at Montagu Square was musical. He recorded demo versions of Beatles songs. I'm Looking Through You, from the Rubber Soul album. That sharp, slightly bitter song about seeing through someone's facade. Paul worked out the arrangement there, refining it before bringing it to Abbey Road. And he developed the composition of Eleanor Rigby. That song, one of the Beatles' most haunting, most literary, most perfectly crafted pieces, took shape in Ringo's basement apartment. Paul working out the melody, the lyrics, the story of lonely people and where they all belong. The song that would feature a string octet instead of guitars. The song that would show the Beatles could transcend rock and roll, could create art songs that belonged in classical concert halls as much as on pop radio. That song was developed at 34 Montagu Square. By late 1966, Paul had moved on. The apartment sat empty again. Ringo still paying the lease, still subletting when the right tenant appeared. And then Chas Chandler called. He was managing this American guitarist who'd just arrived in London. Jimi Hendrix. They needed a place to live. Could Ringo help? £30 a month. For people sharing the space. Deal. Jimi moved in December 1966. And the apartment's most productive creative period began. Jimi had arrived in London in September 1966. Brought by Chas Chandler, former bassist of The Animals, who'd discovered him playing clubs in New York. Within weeks, they'd formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Noel Redding on bass, Mitch Mitchell on drums. Started playing London clubs. Word spreading fast. There's this American guitarist who's unlike anyone we've ever seen. But Jimi needed stability. A home base. Somewhere to write, practice, live. Chas Chandler arranged the sublet through Ringo. £30 a month for the entire apartment. Jimi, Kathy, Chas, and Lotta would share the space. They moved in December 1966. For Jimi, it must have felt surreal. 3 months ago, he'd been grinding it out in New York clubs, backing other artists, never quite finding his voice. Now he was living in a Beatles apartment in central London, creating music that would change rock and roll forever. The apartment became his creative sanctuary. He'd sit with his guitar, always his guitar, even when just hanging around the flat, and work on songs. Experimenting with chord progressions. Finding melodies, letting the music flow through him. One song came together during a fight with Kathy. They'd argued about something, the details lost to time. Kathy stormed out, slammed the door. Jimi picked up his guitar, started playing, let his emotions pour into the instrument. The song became The Wind Cries Mary. Mary was Kathy's middle name. The wind crying Mary was Jimi's way of expressing the pain of their fight, the loneliness of her absence, the hope that she'd return. She did return. They made up. The song remained. It would become one of Jimi's most beloved tracks. Haunting. Beautiful. Proof that great art often emerges from conflict. That apartment, Ringo's apartment, Paul's former studio, soon to be John and Yoko's residence, witnessed the creation of The Wind Cries Mary. While living at Montagu Square, Jimi's career exploded. January 1967, The Jimi Hendrix Experience played the Bag O'Nails Club. Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr in attendance. The first time they'd seen Jimi play live. Both were blown away. February 1967. Jimi appeared on British television. Performed on various shows. Built his reputation. March 1967. Purple Haze, released. The single that would define psychedelic rock. That opening riff. Instantly recognizable, impossible to forget. Jimi's guitar screaming and wailing and transcending. May 1967. The album, Are You Experienced, released in the UK. Immediate critical acclaim. Sales through the roof. Jimi Hendrix becoming a sensation. June 1967. Monterey Pop Festival. Paul McCartney had recommended Jimi for the lineup. Brian Jones flew from London to introduce him. Jimi set his guitar on fire, became an instant legend in America. All of this happened while Jimi was living in Ringo's apartment. That basement flat on Montagu Square wasn't just a place to sleep. It was the foundation for his British breakthrough, the stable base from which he launched a revolution. But revolutions are messy, and Jimi's personal life was becoming chaotic. The neighbors at 34, Montagu Square had been complaining for years. First during Paul McCartney's tenure, the noise from experimental recording sessions. Strange sounds at odd hours. Musicians coming and going. Then during Jimi's residency, loud rehearsals, parties, the general chaos that follows rock stars. The Swiss embassy was located at the back of the building on Montagu Place. In August 1965, an embassy spokesperson had complained about Beatles fans defacing their wall with messages for Ringo. Our back wall is now very unsightly, and we shall have to redecorate. Our chauffeur, who is French and took part in the First World War, says the language some of these young people use is worse than anything he ever heard in the trenches. If World War I trenches couldn't match the language of Beatles fans, imagine the embassy's reaction to Jimi Hendrix living next door. But the noise complaints weren't what ended Jimi's tenancy. It was the LSD trip and the whitewash. The exact date is unclear. Sometime in early 1967. Maybe late February, maybe early March. Jimi took LSD. This wasn't unusual. LSD was common in the London music scene of the late 1960s. The Beatles experimented with it. The Stones. Everyone was exploring consciousness, pushing boundaries, seeing what psychedelic experiences could reveal. But this particular trip went in an unexpected direction. Jimi looked at the walls of the apartment. Ringo had decorated them carefully, expensively. Nice wallpaper, good paint, professional work. And Jimi, in his altered state, decided they needed improvement. He found a can of whitewash, paint used for coating walls, fences, buildings. Thick, white, designed to cover surfaces completely. And he started throwing it. Not carefully painting, not artistically creating a mural. Throwing, splashing, letting the whitewash fly across the walls in patterns that made sense only to his LSD-enhanced perception. Creating psychedelic designs. Abstract expressionism. Art that would horrify anyone not currently experiencing the same trip. By the time Jimi came down from the acid, the apartment looked like a disaster zone. Whitewash everywhere. Dripping down walls. Pooled on floors. Covering Ringo's careful decorating work with chaotic white splashes. Kathy must have been horrified. Chas certainly was. This wasn't their property. This was Ringo Starr's apartment. A Beatles home. And Jimi had just redecorated it while tripping on acid. When Ringo found out, and he found out quickly, he had no choice. This wasn't Ringo being mean or vindictive. He genuinely liked Jimi, respected his music, had attended his shows. But Ringo didn't even own this property outright. He was leasing it. The landlord had rules, expectations, and one of those expectations was that tenants wouldn't throw whitewash all over the walls during acid trips. Moreover, the neighbors had been complaining for years. The landlord was already annoyed about the noise, the parties, the general rockstar chaos. Whitewash-covered walls was the final straw. Ringo evicted Jimi. Not immediately. Jimi wasn't thrown out that day. But the message was clear. You need to find somewhere else to live. Soon. By March 1967, Jimi and Kathy moved out. They found another place. Life continued. Jimi's career kept rising. But his time at 34, Montagu Square was over. 3 months. December 1966 to March 1967. 3 months that changed his life. 3 months of creativity, breakthrough, success. ended by one bad acid trip and a can of whitewash. The apartment's story didn't end with Jimmy's eviction. In fact, its most famous chapter was yet to come. In late 1968, John Lennon and Yoko Ono rented the same apartment for 3 months. This was during one of the most tumultuous periods of John's life. His marriage to Cynthia was ending, his relationship with Yoko beginning. The Beatles were recording the White Album. Brilliant music created amid increasing tensions. John and Yoko needed a place in London, somewhere they could be together away from the chaos. Ringo offered Montagu Square again. They moved in with minimal belongings. Friends later described their lifestyle there as existing on a diet of champagne, caviar, and heroin. Whether literal or metaphorical, it captured the decadence and danger of that moment. In that apartment, the same space where Paul had worked on Eleanor Rigby, where Jimmy had written The Wind Cries Mary, John and Yoko created one of rock's most controversial artworks. They set up a camera on a timer, stood together, removed all their clothes. The photograph that became the cover of their experimental album, Two Virgins, was taken at 34 Montagu Square. Both completely naked, full frontal, no censorship, no apology. The image shocked even the liberated 1960s. Record stores refused to display it. EMI refused to distribute it in the UK. In America, it came in a brown paper wrapper. But John and Yoko didn't care. The photograph was a statement. We have nothing to hide. This is us. Art and life merged. That photograph, taken in Ringo's basement apartment, became one of the most infamous album covers in rock history. Then came the raid. October 18, 1968. Early morning. John had been warned 3 weeks earlier by Don Shorter, a Daily Express reporter, that police were coming. They're coming to get you, Shorter said. John, believing him, cleaned the apartment thoroughly. Jimi Hendrix had lived there, John said later. And I'm not stupid. I went through the whole damn house. But it wasn't enough. Or perhaps the raid was predetermined regardless of what they found. Scotland Yard's drug squad, led by Detective Sergeant Norman Pilcher, arrived with a search warrant. They found hashish. Not much, possibly planted, possibly missed during John's cleaning, but enough. John and Yoko were arrested. Headlines worldwide. John Lennon arrested on drug charges. John eventually pleaded guilty to possession, absolving Yoko, who was pregnant at the time. She would miscarry soon after. He paid a £150 fine. Years later, the raid became even more controversial. Norman Pilcher, the detective who led it, was arrested in November 1973 for conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. He'd committed perjury, planted evidence in other cases, was convicted and sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. Whether the evidence in John's case was planted remains uncertain, but the raid's legitimacy is forever questioned. After the October 1968 raid, the landlord had enough. On February 19, 1969, he sought an injunction against Ringo. The terms were severe. Only Ringo or his immediate family could live at 34 Montagu Square. No more subletting to rock stars and their entourages. No music. No instruments to be played on the premises. The apartment that had hosted the Fool, Paul McCartney, Jimi Hendrix, John Lennon, and Yoko Ono was being shut down as a creative space. Ringo appealed. A compromise was reached. Only Ringo or a family member could live there. The subletting era was over. But really, the magic had already ended. By 1969, Ringo terminated the lease entirely. The apartment would continue to exist, continue to house residents, but its time as the epicenter of London's music scene had passed. The period between 1965 and 1969, when that basement flat at 34 Montagu Square hosted some of the greatest musicians of the era, became legend. Looking back now, the whitewash incident seems almost trivial. Jimi Hendrix, one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived, got kicked out of an apartment for throwing paint on the walls during an acid trip. It's the kind of story that makes you smile. Rockstar excess. 1960s chaos. The kind of thing that seems inevitable in retrospect. But at the time, it mattered. Jimmy needed stability. Needed a home base. Losing the Montagu Square apartment meant finding somewhere new, dealing with the stress of moving, disrupting the creative flow. Yet he managed. Because Jimmy always managed. His genius couldn't be contained by circumstances. Whether living in a Beatles apartment or sleeping on friends' couches, the music kept coming. The Wind Cries Mary, written in that apartment, remains one of his most beautiful songs. The work he did while living there, the shows, the recordings, the creative development, laid the foundation for everything that followed. And years later, fans would make pilgrimages to 34 Montagu Square. Stand on the street. Look at the building. Imagine Jimmy inside, guitar in hand, creating magic. Imagine Paul working on Eleanor Rigby. Imagine John and Yoko shooting that controversial photograph. If those walls could talk, if the whitewash-covered walls could speak, they'd tell stories of genius and chaos, creativity and excess, the best and worst of the 1960s rock scene. There's a blue plaque on the exterior wall of 34 Montagu Square now. It reads, John Lennon, 1940 to 1980. Musician and songwriter lived here in 1968. No mention of Jimi Hendrix. No mention of Paul McCartney. Just John Lennon. Perhaps because John's arrest made the biggest headlines. Perhaps because the Beatles' connection to the building is what people remember most. But locals know the full story. Music historians know. Anyone who's studied Jimmy's time in London knows. 34 Montagu Square isn't just where John Lennon lived. It's where Paul McCartney created. Where Jimi Hendrix wrote, The Wind Cries Mary. Where rock and roll history was made, one basement apartment at a time. And yes, it's where Jimi Hendrix got evicted for throwing whitewash on the walls during an acid trip. That too is part of the legacy. Ringo and Jimmy remained on good terms despite the eviction. Ringo understood. It was the 1960s. Everyone was experimenting. Things got messy sometimes. That's what happened when you mixed rock stars, LSD, and rental properties. The Beatles continued to support Jimmy. Paul had already recommended him for Monterey. John and Ringo attended his shows. They recognized his genius. One incident with whitewash wasn't going to change that. And Jimmy? He moved on, found new places to live, kept creating, kept pushing boundaries. 3 years later, September 18, 1970, he'd be gone, dead at 27, an entire era ending with his death. But in December 1966, moving into that Montagu Square apartment, none of that tragedy was visible on the horizon. There was only the music, the possibilities, the excitement of being in London, creating something new, living in a Beatles apartment for £30 a month, creating The Wind Cries Mary after a fight with his girlfriend, releasing Purple Haze and watching it climb the charts, playing Monterey and setting his guitar on fire, living the dream until one night, on acid, he decided the walls needed redecorating. London, Marylebone, 34 Montagu Square, December 1966 to March 1967. 3 months that changed rock and roll, and one can of whitewash that ended a tendency but couldn't stop a revolution.